Detective Sarah Chen's heart pounded as she walked through the towering marble corridors of the Denver Federal Courthouse on that crisp Thursday morning. Her K-9 partner Max, a magnificent 4-year-old German shepherd with a perfectly groomed black and tan coat, trotting obediently beside her. The morning sun streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the pristine floor. Sarah could feel the weight of every eye upon them as they passed other police officers, courthouse staff, and early arriving spectators. This was unprecedented territory. Judge Patricia Morrison had made an extraordinary and highly controversial decision that morning at 8:15 a.m. during a closed-door conference with both the prosecution and defense teams. Allow Max into the courtroom. Not in the gallery, not outside the proceedings, but right there, present during live testimony. The reason was simple but profound, and it stemmed from one woman's unbearable trauma. Rachel Martinez, the prosecution's star witness in what had been dubbed the Westside home invasion case by local media, had experienced severe emotional and psychological trauma 3 months ago. She'd survived a violent encounter with the defendant, Marcus Webb, a cold-blooded criminal with a history of escalating violence. During that terrifying night, Marcus Webb had broken into her home while she was alone, knowing her husband was away on a business trip. He'd held a knife to her throat, demanded her valuables, and left her bound to a chair, traumatized beyond measure. The experience had left Rachel with severe PTSD, anxiety attacks, and crippling panic whenever she had to relive the event in her mind. The prosecution had spent weeks trying to prepare Rachel for her testimony. Victim advocates had worked with her extensively. Therapists had provided coping strategies. But as the trial date approached, Rachel's anxiety had become increasingly severe. Her attorney, James Richardson, had submitted a motion requesting that a therapy dog be allowed in the courtroom during her testimony. The motion had been initially denied by Judge Morrison. But after Rachel had suffered a complete panic attack during a witness preparation session just 2 days ago, collapsing on the floor and hyperventilating uncontrollably for 15 minutes, Judge Morrison had reconsidered. That's when Sarah Chen's name had come up. Sarah was known throughout the Denver Police Department as not just an exemplary K-9 handler, but as someone who understood the profound therapeutic power of the human-animal bond. She had personally trained Max in victim support protocols. More importantly, she had the respect of both law enforcement and the judicial system. When Judge Morrison's clerk had called Sarah late Wednesday afternoon, asking if she could bring Max to the courtroom the following morning, Sarah had been stunned, but she hadn't hesitated. "Of course," she'd said immediately. "Max and I will be there." Now, as Sarah and Max approached the entrance to courtroom 7B, Sarah took a deep breath to calm her own racing mind. She had worked with Max for 6 extraordinary years. They had been through rigorous training together. They had responded to hundreds of calls. They had found missing children, apprehended dangerous criminals, and provided comfort in tragic situations. But this was different. This was stepping into uncharted territory. Max seemed to sense Sarah's heightened emotions because he pressed his warm body slightly against her leg as they walked. The gesture was comforting, a nonverbal communication between handler and dog that had developed through years of partnership. Sarah's fingers absently reached down to stroke his head, and she felt his muscles relax slightly beneath her touch. Max was calm. If Max was calm, she could be calm too. The courtroom doors loomed before them, heavy wooden doors with brass handles, imposing and official. Sarah paused for just a moment before pushing them open. She could hear the murmur of conversation inside, the rustling of papers, the sounds of people settling into their seats before the judge entered. She knew what this moment meant. She knew that bringing a police dog into a federal courtroom during an active trial could set a precedent. If it worked well, it could change how law enforcement and the judicial system approached victim testimony in traumatic cases across the entire country. If it didn't work, if Max became distracted, if he caused any disruption, if anything went wrong, It could damage the case and potentially undermine future attempts to use therapy animals in similar situations. Sarah pushed the doors open, and Max walked in beside her with perfect composure. The courtroom fell silent. Every single person turned to look at them. Sarah could see the initial expressions of surprise on the jurors' faces, some skepticism on the faces of the defense team, and cautious hope on the faces of the prosecution attorneys. She led Max to the area near the prosecution's table, to a spot the judge and both attorneys had agreed upon during the morning conference. It was a position where Max would be visible, but not obstructing anyone's view of the witness stand. "Good boy, Max," Sarah whispered, and the dog settled into a perfectly relaxed down position, his head resting on his paws, his body language radiating complete calm and confidence. Sarah sat in the front row of the gallery, keeping her hand lightly resting on Max's back, maintaining that subtle physical connection that grounded both of them. The courtroom doors opened again, and bailiffs led in the defendant, Marcus Webb. Sarah's jaw tightened as she studied him. He was tall, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. His expensive suit and carefully groomed appearance were clearly designed to create an impression of respectability, to contrast with the violent crimes he was accused of committing. But Sarah had reviewed the case file. She had seen photographs of Rachel's injuries. She had read the details of the violence he was capable of. No suit, no amount of grooming, could hide what Marcus Webb truly was. The judge entered, and everyone rose. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Morrison," the bailiff announced. Judge Morrison took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and looked directly at Max. She nodded slightly, acknowledging his presence. Then she looked at the courtroom as a whole and spoke in her clear, authoritative voice. "We are resuming testimony in the case of the People versus Marcus Webb. The defense is aware that a certified therapy dog will be present during witness testimony. This is an accommodation made for the witness's well-being and will not influence the proceedings in any way. I expect professional behavior from everyone in this courtroom. Now, let's continue." As the morning progressed, Sarah felt Max relax even further. His breathing became steady and rhythmic. His eyes remained soft and alert but not tense. He was exactly what he had been trained to be, a calm, grounding presence in the midst of legal chaos and human suffering. Sarah whispered softly to Max, her voice so quiet only the dog could hear. "This is our moment, boy. Let's show them what we can do. Rachel needs us. This entire case needs us. Let's make sure justice wins today." Max's tail thumped once against the floor, a subtle acknowledgement of his handler's determination. Together, they settled in to wait for the testimony that would change everything. The morning proceeded with methodical legal procedure. Opening statements had already been delivered over the previous week, and several witnesses had already testified. Neighbors who heard suspicious noises, police officers who had responded to Rachel's 911 call, forensic experts who had presented physical evidence. But everyone in the courtroom knew that Rachel Martinez's testimony was the linchpin. The entire case hinged on her ability to positively identify Marcus Webb as the man who had invaded her home, held a knife to her throat, and terrorized her in the most intimate and violent way possible. By 2:35 p.m., the prosecution team was ready. James Richardson, a meticulous attorney in his early 50s with steel-gray hair and sharp features, gathered his notes and stood. He approached the judge's bench and spoke quietly with Judge Morrison. Sarah watched from her position in the front row, her hand still resting gently on Max's back. The dog remained in perfect composure, his breathing steady, his eyes alert but relaxed. Everything about Max communicated one simple message: "I am calm. You can be calm too." At 2:47 p.m. precisely, the bailiff announced, "The prosecution calls Rachel Martinez to the witness stand." The courtroom doors opened, and Rachel emerged. Sarah's heart immediately went out to the young woman. Rachel was 32 years old, attractive in a fragile sort of way, with dark hair pulled back into a neat ponytail and wearing a pale blue dress. a color choice that had been deliberately recommended by the victim advocate to project vulnerability and trustworthiness. But what was most noticeable about Rachel was her visible terror. She walked slowly toward the witness stand, her hands trembling noticeably. Her legs seemed to move in slow motion, as if she were wading through thick water. Every eye in the courtroom followed her. The jury members leaned forward slightly, already absorbing her fear and uncertainty. This was exactly what the defense would exploit. Defense attorneys, Sarah knew, were trained to spot vulnerability and attack it relentlessly. Rachel was sworn in by the bailiff. She placed her hand on the Bible and spoke the oath in a voice so quiet that the court reporter had to ask her to repeat it louder. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God," Rachel repeated, her voice still barely above a whisper. Prosecutor James Richardson began gently. His first questions were designed to establish Rachel's background, her credibility, her character. "Ms. Martinez, where were you living 3 months ago on the night of April 15th? "I was living in the house on Maple Street, the one that was broken into," Rachel answered, her voice gaining slightly more strength. "And where was your husband that evening?" "He was in Chicago on a business trip. He wouldn't be home for another 3 days. Richardson guided her through the early evening building context. Rachel described how she had been reading in bed, how she had heard a noise in the kitchen around 11:30 p.m., how she had called out thinking it was her husband. Then her voice began to shake as she described hearing footsteps approaching the bedroom. "I saw a figure in the doorway. He was dark, I couldn't see him clearly at first, but then he turned and the hallway light caught his face and I could see." "Take your time, Ms. Martinez," Richardson said gently. "What did you see?" "I saw his face," Rachel continued, her voice cracking. "He had cold eyes, really cold, like nothing I'd ever seen before, and he was holding something in his hand. I realized it was a knife, a big knife." From the defense table, Marcus Webb sat with a slight smirk on his face, his expensive suit catching the fluorescent courtroom lights. He seemed utterly unconcerned, almost amused by Rachel's terror. This calculated coldness was precisely the kind of thing that would infuriate a jury, but only if the defense attorney could keep them focused on his client's rights rather than his apparent lack of humanity. Richardson's questioning continued for another 20 minutes, establishing the details of the invasion. Rachel described how Marcus Webb had ordered her at knife point to give him her jewelry and cash. She described the feeling of the cold blade against her throat. She described being tied to a chair while he ransacked the house. Her voice wavered constantly, tears sliding down her cheeks as she relived one of the worst moments of her life. Then, at 3:15 p.m., Richardson said the words that would trigger the chaos to come. "I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor. The witness is yours, Counselor." Victor Blackwood rose from his chair with theatrical slowness. He was tall, probably 6'3", with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to bore into people's souls. He was wearing an immaculate charcoal suit that probably cost more than Sarah made in 3 months. Everything about Victor Blackwood screamed confidence, intelligence, and ruthlessness. He had a reputation for destroying witnesses, for finding every inconsistency, every moment of uncertainty, and exploiting it until the jury doubted everything the witness had said. "Ms. Martinez," Blackwood began, his voice smooth and controlled, "let me ask you something. On the night in question, what medications were you taking?" I take Ambien sometimes for sleep," Rachel answered hesitantly. Blackwood's eyes lit up as if he'd just discovered gold. "You take Ambien, a powerful prescription sleeping medication, and you're testifying that on the very night of this alleged incident, you were able to clearly observe and remember the face of your attacker." "Yes, I wasn't taking it that night. I only take it when I have trouble sleeping, and I was just reading." "So you say," Blackwood interrupted, his tone dripping with insinuation. "But isn't it true that Ambien can remain in your system even on nights you don't take it? Isn't it true that Ambien users often have impaired memory and cognitive function?" Rachel's face went pale, I don't think so, my doctor said. Yes or no, Ms. Martinez, Blackwood snapped. Do you or do you not have a history of memory problems related to your medication use? No, I mean I don't have problems, I just... Just what? Blackwood moved closer, circling like a predator. Just maybe don't remember things clearly. Just maybe confuse faces. Just maybe your identification of my client is based on faulty memories influenced by prescription drugs. Sarah felt Max shift slightly beneath her hand. The dog sensed the aggression, the hostility in Blackwood's voice. But Max remained controlled, didn't react, just pressed slightly more firmly against Sarah's leg, a signal that he was aware of the conflict in the room. Rachel was crying openly now. I know what I saw. I will never forget his face, the way he looked at me. What you remember experiencing isn't necessarily what actually occurred, Blackwood stated coldly. Isn't it true that you were also suffering from panic attacks after this incident? That you've been seeing a therapist? That you've been on anti-anxiety medication? Yes, because I was traumatized. Traumatized people often create false memories, Blackwood said flatly. Their minds fill in gaps with information that didn't actually occur. Your Honor, I submit that this witness's testimony is unreliable at best and completely fabricated at worst. Judge Morrison's jaw tightened. Mr. Blackwood, that's argumentative. Rephrase your question. But the damage was done. Blackwood had planted seeds of doubt in the jury's minds. He had systematically attacked Rachel's credibility, using her own trauma against her, twisting her medication use and mental health treatment into evidence of unreliability. Rachel's testimony continued for another 45 minutes as Blackwood methodically dismantled her confidence, questioned every detail, suggested alternative explanations for everything she claimed to have witnessed. By the time Judge Morrison called for a 15-minute recess at 4:00 p.m., Rachel was completely shattered. Her hands shook uncontrollably. Her face was blotchy from crying. She looked utterly defeated, destroyed by an attorney whose sole purpose was to plant doubt in the jury's mind. As Rachel was led from the witness stand by a victim advocate, she passed directly in front of Sarah and Max. For just a moment, their eyes met. Sarah saw complete despair there. Rachel looked broken, hopeless, as if she believed her testimony had failed, as if justice would not be served. The bailiff announced the 15-minute recess, and the courtroom erupted into movement and conversation. In the third row of the gallery, behind Detective Sarah Chen, sat the Morrison family. Tom Morrison was a 52-year-old accountant with graying temples and the perpetually tired expression of a man who worked too many hours. Linda Morrison, his wife of 18 years, was a nurse at Denver Children's Hospital, accustomed to managing chaos but currently at the end of her rope. Between them sat their youngest child, Emma Morrison, aged 3 years and 8 months, who had absolutely no business being in a federal courtroom but was here because their regular babysitter, Mrs. Chen, no relation to Detective Chen, had called in sick at 7 a.m. that morning. Emma was a beautiful child with her mother's dark eyes and her father's sandy blonde hair. She wore a pink dress with white flowers embroidered on the hem and white Mary Jane shoes that she'd chosen specifically because they had sparkly things on them. But despite the cute outfit, Emma was bored. Desperately, phenomenally bored in the way only a 3-year-old trapped in an adult environment could be. Linda had come prepared, at least. She'd brought a coloring book, one of those books with thick black outlines and primary colors that were supposedly impossible for toddlers to mess up. She'd also brought crayons in a small zippered case. Emma had been coloring for approximately 6 minutes before losing interest entirely. Now she was just moving the crayons around, occasionally pressing the tip against the paper without actually making marks. The coloring book was titled Friendly Animals Around the World, and the page Emma was nominally working on featured a giraffe. But Emma's attention had wandered completely away from the giraffe around the time her mother had leaned forward with a sigh, and started watching the proceedings with a look of grim determination. That's when Emma noticed Max. The German Shepherd sat in the front area near the prosecution's table, and to a child's eyes, he was the most magnificent creature on earth. Emma had seen dogs before, of course. Her grandmother had a golden retriever named Butterscotch who was sweet and lazy and mostly slept in patches of sunlight. But this dog was different. This dog was huge. This dog had muscles. This dog had alert ears that moved independently, swiveling toward different sounds. This dog had the posture of a warrior. Emma's small body went rigid. The crayon fell from her hand, rolling under the bench. But she didn't care about the crayon anymore. She didn't care about the giraffe. She didn't care about anything except the dog. Max, she whispered under her breath, trying out the name she'd heard Detective Chen say. Max. For the next 45 minutes, while Rachel testified and the attorneys questioned her, Emma did nothing but stare at Max. She watched him breathe. She watched his ears rotate when sounds caught his attention. She watched the way his muscles rippled beneath his sleek coat when he shifted his position slightly. She watched his eyes, those intelligent, alert, incredibly aware eyes, scan the courtroom with the precision of a security camera. To Emma, Max wasn't just a dog. Max was magic. Max was safety. Max was the most interesting thing that had ever existed in her 3-year-old experience. At one point, Sarah Chen glanced back and noticed Emma's intense focus on Max. Sarah smiled, a genuine, warm smile that conveyed perfect understanding. She caught Emma's eye and gave her a small nod of acknowledgement, as if to say, "Yes, Max is pretty special, isn't he?" Emma's face lit up at this recognition from the detective. It was as if she'd been validated in her belief that this dog was extraordinary. Emma tried to get a better look, shifting her position in her seat, craning her neck slightly to the left. She wanted to see Max's face more clearly. She wanted to understand what made him so different from Butterscotch. Butterscotch was friendly and cuddly, but this dog radiated something else entirely. This dog radiated confidence. This dog radiated purpose. This dog radiated protection. When James Richardson asked Rachel about the night of the invasion, Emma didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She understood the serious expressions on everyone's faces. At age 3, Emma couldn't comprehend legal proceedings or criminal trials, but she was remarkably perceptive about emotional atmosphere. She could feel the tension in the courtroom the way a dog feels an approaching thunderstorm. As Rachel's voice grew shakier, as the emotional intensity increased, Emma felt something shift inside her. The courtroom, which had been interesting because of Max, was beginning to feel wrong. The adult energy was changing. Something bad was happening. Emma didn't understand what, but her primitive brain recognized it as threat. When Rachel described the knife, Emma didn't catch the specific word, but she caught the fear in the woman's voice. Pure terror. Emma had never heard an adult sound quite so frightened. It scared her. Her small hands began to fidget with the edge of her dress. She looked back at Max, searching for reassurance. Max was completely still. Max was completely calm. Max's presence seemed to say, "Everything is okay. I am here. I will keep everyone safe." Emma found comfort in that, her anxiety dropping several degrees simply from looking at the steadfast dog. Then Victor Blackwood began his cross-examination, and everything changed. Blackwood's voice was different. It was sharp and cutting and cruel in ways that Emma's primitive consciousness recognized immediately. This man was angry. This man was attacking the frightened woman. Emma watched as Rachel began to cry, watched as her entire body started shaking, watched as the woman on the stand became increasingly small and terrified. Emma's anxiety spiked dramatically. She didn't understand words like medication or credibility or unreliable testimony. But she understood that an adult was being hurt. She understood that there was cruelty in this room. She understood that something very wrong was happening. Her small body began to tense. Her breathing became shallow. She started twisting in her seat, her knees drawing up toward her chest. The coloring book and crayons fell to the floor, forgotten. Linda noticed her daughter's distress. "Emma, what's wrong?" she whispered, leaning down. "Are you okay?" But Emma couldn't articulate what was wrong. She just knew that the bad feelings in the room were getting worse. The man with the sharp voice was hurting the crying lady. The emotions were becoming overwhelming, pressing down on her small body like a physical weight. When Judge Morrison called for the 15-minute recess at 4:00 p.m., Emma was in full distress mode. Her eyes were glistening with unshed tears. Her little hands were clenched into fists. Her breath was coming in shallow, rapid gasps. The emotional contagion from the adults in the room had completely overwhelmed her coping mechanisms. "Emma, we need to stay," her mother said, perhaps more sharply than she intended. Linda was exhausted. 3 weeks of sitting in a courtroom with a young child was wearing her patience incredibly thin. "Please just calm down and try to sit still." But Emma couldn't calm down. She couldn't sit still. Every cell in her 3-year-old body was screaming that something was wrong, that there was danger, that she needed to escape. Sarah Chen watched from her position at the front. She saw Linda struggling with Emma. She saw the child's escalating distress. She saw a small person being emotionally overwhelmed by forces she couldn't possibly understand or control. And Sarah realized that this was exactly the moment when Max was needed most. Not for Rachel, not for the trial, not for any legal proceeding. Max was needed for Emma. The 15-minute recess had been called, and the courtroom erupted into movement. Bailiffs began escorting Rachel Martinez from the witness stand, and victim advocates immediately swarmed around her, guiding her toward a private consultation room where she could compose herself away from the public eye. But Rachel moved like a woman in shock, her feet shuffling mechanically, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The cross-examination had devastated her, stripped away her confidence, left her questioning her own memories and perception. James Richardson, the prosecutor, sat at his table with his head in his hands. His lead witness, the cornerstone of his case, had been methodically dismantled by Victor Blackwood's surgical precision. Richardson knew that juries were unpredictable, but he also knew that jurors were human, and humans were influenced by what they perceived. Right now, they were perceiving a woman who was medicated, traumatized, and possibly unreliable. That perception could cost him the entire case. In the gallery, meanwhile, something far more dramatic was unfolding. Emma Morrison's distress had not diminished during the recess. If anything, it had intensified. While other courtroom spectators stood, stretched, and chatted quietly, Emma sat rigid in her seat, her small body trembling visibly. Tears had begun to flow freely down her cheeks, though she wasn't making noise yet. Her mother Linda sat beside her, trying to maintain composure while feeling increasingly frustrated and helpless. "Emma, we have to stay until the end of today," Linda whispered, her voice carrying an edge of exhaustion that a 3-year-old could not help but interpret as anger. "Everyone here has important things to do. We all have to sit quietly." But Emma couldn't sit quietly. Emma's nervous system had been hijacked by the emotional intensity of the courtroom. She had absorbed, through some primal mechanism that child psychologists would spend years trying to explain, the terror in Rachel's voice, the aggression in Blackwood's tone, the tension radiating from every adult in the room. And now, stuck in a confined space with no escape and no way to process what she was experiencing, Emma was beginning to panic. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, her hands clenched and unclenched. Her legs kicked slightly against the bench in front of her. She wanted to run. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to get away from this place, to escape the bad feelings, to find somewhere safe. "I'm scared," Emma whimpered quietly, her voice barely audible. "Mommy, I'm scared. I want to go home." Linda placed her hand on Emma's forehead, checking for fever. "You're not sick, sweetheart. We just need to be brave for a little bit longer." But Emma wasn't physically sick. She was emotionally overwhelmed in a way that a tired, frustrated mother couldn't fix with reassurance or a cool hand on her forehead. Emma needed something more. Emma needed to feel safe again, and nothing in this courtroom felt safe anymore. Tom Morrison had stepped outside to answer a work call, leaving Linda completely alone with their increasingly distressed daughter. This was the moment that Linda would later describe as one of the most helpless feelings she'd ever experienced. Here she was, a trained nurse who worked with sick children every single day, and she couldn't help her own daughter. She couldn't fix what was wrong because what was wrong wasn't something that could be fixed with medicine or bandages, or any of the standard tools of her profession. Emma's whimpering escalated into genuine crying. Real tears flowed down her cheeks. Her lower lip trembled uncontrollably. Her small shoulders began to shake as sobs racked her tiny frame. Other spectators began to glance over, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to annoyed. A few gave Linda looks that clearly communicated, "Can't you control your child?" Linda felt her frustration mounting. She had tried everything. Coloring books, snacks, whispered explanations, warnings about being good. Nothing worked. And now, with everyone in the courtroom turning to look at her daughter, Linda felt the weight of public judgment bearing down on her. "Emma, please," she said, perhaps more sharply than she had intended. "Please just sit still and be quiet. Everyone is looking at us." But the awareness that everyone was looking at them only made Emma's anxiety worse. She buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her small body convulsing with sobs that seemed completely disproportionate to a 3-year-old's usual emotional range. This wasn't a tantrum. This was a child in genuine distress, experiencing anxiety that she had no vocabulary to articulate and no coping mechanisms to manage. Linda felt tears beginning to burn in her own eyes. She was a good mother. She knew she was a good mother. But in this moment, with her daughter falling apart in public and no way to comfort her, she felt like a complete failure. Meanwhile, at the front of the courtroom, Sarah Chen observed everything. Her detective's eyes had been trained to notice details that others missed. She had watched Rachel's devastation. She had watched Victor Blackwood's predatory satisfaction. And she was watching Emma Morrison's escalating panic attack with increasing concern. Sarah understood children. She had worked extensively with traumatized children during her years in law enforcement. She knew that children absorbed emotional energy like sponges. They picked up on tension, fear, and aggression in ways that were invisible to adults. A child could sense a dangerous person across a room. A child could feel anxiety radiating from an adult like heat from a fire. Emma was in full sensory overload. And Sarah realized, in that moment of crystal clarity, that this was exactly why Judge Morrison had allowed Max into the courtroom in the first place. Max was lying in his perfect down position, his chin resting on his front paws, his eyes slightly closed in complete relaxation. Sarah could feel his heartbeat steady and calm against her leg, where her hand rested on his back. The dog was the antithesis of the courtroom's emotional chaos. He was grounded. He was safe. He was exactly what Emma needed. Sarah made a decision in that moment. It was a decision that went beyond courtroom procedures and judges' instructions. It was a decision made by someone who understood that sometimes the letter of the law had to take a backseat to the spirit of justice and human compassion. She leaned down and whispered softly to Max, barely audible to anyone more than a few feet away. "Comfort work," she said, repeating the command she had given earlier. But this time it wasn't for Rachel. This time it was for Emma. Max's eyes opened. His ears perked up. His entire body came alert, though he remained in his down position, waiting for the next command. Sarah could feel the shift in him, the moment when the therapy dog protocol activated, overriding his normal police dog protocols. "Go comfort," Sarah whispered, and she removed her hand from Max's back, releasing him from her control. Max rose smoothly without any of the exuberance of a normal dog. There were no jumping, no excited movements. Every action was deliberate, measured, purposeful. The dog turned slowly toward the Morrison family, toward the sound of Emma's sobbing, toward the child who was drowning in emotional overwhelm. Sarah watched as every attorney, every judge's clerk, every bailiff, and every jury member noticed Max's movement. But they didn't know what was happening. They didn't understand that Detective Chen had just made a compassion-based decision that would, in just a few moments, change the entire trajectory of the trial. Max began walking, his massive frame moving with the grace and intention of a creature on a sacred mission. He approached Emma Morrison not as a police dog, not as a trained law enforcement tool, but as a being who understood with absolute certainty that this frightened child needed help. Emma saw him coming. Through her tears, through her panic, she saw the large German shepherd approaching her. And in that moment, before anything else happened, before any of the extraordinary events that would follow, Emma's breathing began to slow. Her heartbeat began to regulate. Her body began to recognize that help had arrived. Max was coming to save her. Max's paws made soft clicking sounds against the polished courtroom floor as he walked toward the Morrison family. Click, 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 click. The sound was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, and it seemed to capture everyone's attention. Conversations that had been ongoing during the recess began to falter and stop. People who had been standing, stretching, checking their phones, all of them turned to look at the large German shepherd moving with deliberate purpose through the center aisle. But Max didn't acknowledge any of them. His entire focus was laser-locked on Emma Morrison. Sarah had removed her hand from his back when she gave the command, breaking the physical connection that normally kept Max tethered to her. But the dog didn't wander or sniff or engage in any of the normal behaviors of a dog suddenly freed from control. Instead, Max moved like a creature on a mission, his massive frame gliding forward with absolute certainty. Every muscle was engaged, every movement was intentional, every breath seemed calculated. Max had been trained in victim support protocols for 3 years. Sarah had worked with him extensively during his socialization period, teaching him to recognize signs of distress in humans. He had been exposed to people crying, people in panic attacks, people experiencing trauma. He had learned to respond not with excitement or playfulness, but with calm, grounded presence. But this was different. This wasn't just training responding. This was something deeper. As Max approached the third row of the gallery, Emma's sobbing intensified momentarily. Her panic, sensing the approach of this large creature, spiked briefly. Linda's arm instinctively tightened around her daughter, unsure whether to welcome this intervention or protect her child from it. "It's okay," Sarah called softly from the front, her voice carrying just enough authority to communicate that this was intentional. "Max is trained. He's here to help." Linda hesitated for just a moment, then relaxed her grip slightly. She had heard the authority in Sarah's voice. She had seen the deliberate nature of the dog's approach. She recognized that something purposeful was happening, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. Max reached the bench where Emma sat. He didn't jump. He didn't bark. He didn't make any sudden movements. Instead, the massive dog lowered his enormous frame, bending his front legs so that he was closer to Emma's height. His movement was so slow, so deliberate, that it was almost meditative. When Max finally reached his new position, his head was only slightly higher than Emma's, positioned so that the child could look directly into his eyes without having to crane her neck. Emma's sobbing stopped abruptly. The sudden arrival of this magnificent creature, a being of such obvious power and presence, seemed to snap her out of her panic spiral. Her eyes widened. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to slow. Tears still streamed down her cheeks, but the quality of her distress shifted. She was no longer in full panic. She was now in a state of uncertain curiosity. Max simply breathed. His breathing was deep and rhythmic, and Emma, without any conscious decision to do so, began to synchronize her own breathing with his. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. The dog's massive sides expanded and contracted with each breath, and Emma found herself mesmerized by the sight and sound of it. Throughout the courtroom, people had gone completely still. The bailiffs weren't moving. The attorneys weren't conferring. Judge Morrison, stepping back into the courtroom to signal that the recess was ending, had stopped dead in her tracks, watching the scene unfold before her. Even the court reporter sat with her hands poised above her keyboard, uncertain whether she should be documenting this moment. Max's amber eyes remained fixed on Emma's brown eyes. There was no judgment in Max's gaze, no demand for anything, no expectation that Emma behave any particular way. Max's eyes communicated one simple message: "You are safe. I am here. Everything is going to be okay." Emma's small hand moved slowly, as if moving through water. Her trembling fingers reached out and made contact with Max's head, right between his ears. The dog didn't move. He didn't lick her face or try to nuzzle her or do any of the things that untrained dogs might do. Max simply allowed her hand to rest on his head, maintaining eye contact, maintaining his breathing, maintaining his absolute presence. Linda Morrison watched her daughter in amazement. The panic, the anxiety, the overwhelming distress that had been consuming Emma for the past 15 minutes, all of it seemed to be draining away, flowing out of the child's small body as if the dog was drawing it out through some form of emotional osmosis. Sarah, watching from the front of the courtroom, felt her heart swell with pride and emotion. This was why she had trained Max. This was what all those hours of work had been for. Not for catching criminals, not for apprehending suspects, not even for protecting officers. All of it had been leading to this moment, the moment when Max could help a frightened child find peace. But what happened next surprised even Sarah. Emma, her small hand still resting on Max's head, began to look around the courtroom. Her panic had been replaced by something else, a strange kind of clarity that comes sometimes when a person is pulled back from the edge of overwhelming distress. Emma had been drowning in the emotional chaos of the courtroom, but Max had thrown her a lifeline. Now, pulled back to shore, she could see things with new eyes. She could see the attorneys. She could see the judge. She could see the man sitting at the defense table, the man with the cold eyes and the sharp voice, the man who had spoken so cruelly to the crying woman, the man whose voice had made her feel afraid. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table with his arms crossed, watching the scene with cold indifference. He had made no move to object to Max's intervention, partly because such an objection would have been seen as heartless by the jury, and partly because he seemed utterly unaffected by the emotional dynamics unfolding before him. His expression was unchanging, his demeanor untouched by the moment's significance. But Emma saw him, really saw him, and something in her 3-year-old consciousness recognized something in him that the legal system had been struggling to prove for 3 weeks. Evil, not the abstract concept of crime or guilt or legal culpability, but something more primal, something that a child's unsocialized brain could recognize without legal framework or adult bias, something that her nervous system had been screaming about throughout Rachel's testimony. Emma's hand remained on Max's head. Max remained absolutely still, his breathing steady and grounding. And in that moment, with a dog's quiet presence anchoring her, Emma seemed to recognize a profound truth about the man at the defense table. Judge Morrison stood in the courtroom entrance, frozen by the power of the moment. She had authorized Max's presence for Rachel's testimony, never imagining that the dog's most important work would happen during recess, with a small child who had nothing to do with the trial. Victor Blackwood watched with an expression of contempt barely concealed. He had seen many things in his career as a defense attorney, but he had never seen anything quite like this. A police dog providing comfort to a child, potentially creating an emotional atmosphere that could influence the jury. It was unprecedented. It was potentially powerful, and it was completely outside his control. Max continued his perfect stillness, asking nothing of Emma, demanding nothing, simply being a presence of absolute calm in the midst of chaos. The dog seemed to understand something profound about what Emma needed in this moment. And through his presence, through his unwavering focus, through his grounding breathing, Max was teaching Emma something that no adult had been able to teach her. She was safe, she was protected, and the truth, whatever that truth was, would prevail. The recess was officially over. Judge Morrison stepped fully into the courtroom, ready to resume proceedings. But everyone in that room knew that something fundamental had shifted. Something intangible but utterly real had changed. Emma's hand remained on Max's head, and Max remained absolutely still, waiting for whatever came next, grounded in the knowledge that he was exactly where he needed to be. The courtroom held its breath, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. Literally, every person in that room seemed to simultaneously stop breathing, as if the universe itself had paused to witness what was about to unfold. Judge Morrison stood at the entrance to the courtroom, her hand still on the heavy wooden door. She had been about to announce that the recess was over, that proceedings would resume, but something in her recognized that a moment of profound significance was occurring, and the normal rules of courtroom procedure needed to yield to something larger. Emma's small hand remained on Max's head. Her breathing, which had synchronized with the dog's, continued its deep, rhythmic pattern. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. With each breath, Emma seemed to become more present, more grounded, more connected to this moment in time. Max's eyes never wavered from Emma's face. The dog was completely still, his massive body a portrait of perfect calm and control. Every muscle was engaged, every nerve was alert, yet nothing about Max communicated anything other than absolute peace. It was as if the dog understood that he was holding space for something momentous to occur. Linda Morrison stood beside her daughter, her own breathing suspended, her own anxiety momentarily forgotten. She watched in awe as her 3-year-old daughter, her baby, her youngest, her littlest child, seemed to be having some kind of profound experience. Linda had never seen Emma like this. She had never seen her daughter so completely calm, so utterly present, so strangely wise in a way that didn't make logical sense. Sarah Chen, still sitting in the front row, felt tears beginning to burn in her eyes. She knew what was happening. She had trained for this moment without fully understanding what it would look like. She had prepared Max for victim support work without knowing that his most important work would be helping a frightened child find clarity. Victor Blackwood remained at the defense table, his face a mask of controlled indifference. But his hands, resting on the table in front of him, had gone white at the knuckles. He understood on some level that something was shifting, something was changing. The narrative he had so carefully constructed was being rewritten by a dog and a 3-year-old child. Marcus Webb sat beside his attorney with an expression of complete disdain. He seemed utterly unmoved by the emotional tableau unfolding in the courtroom. He had no understanding that the moment of his judgment was arriving, not through the legal system or the jury or the attorneys, but through the pure, unfiltered perception of a child whose nervous system was finally calm enough to see clearly. Emma's eyes, which had been fixed on Max, began to move. Slowly, deliberately, as if her head were moving through molasses, Emma turned to look at the defense table. Her gaze traveled across the courtroom, past the attorneys, past the bailiffs, past all the trappings of the legal system, and came to rest directly on Marcus Webb. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Emma's innocent brown eyes and Marcus Webb's cold, calculating eyes. Child and criminal, truth and deception, light and darkness. And something extraordinary happened in that moment of connection. Emma's hand, which had been gently resting on Max's head, suddenly became animated. Her small arm extended, and her tiny finger pointed directly at Marcus Webb. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and absolutely certain. Not the uncertain point of a child confused about direction, but the definitive point of someone who knew exactly what she was indicating. Time seemed to stop entirely. Every single person in the courtroom felt the seismic shift. The bailiff straightened. The court reporter's hands froze above her keyboard. Judge Morrison's mouth opened slightly in a silent gasp. The jury members leaned forward almost imperceptibly, as if magnetized by what was happening. And then Emma spoke. Her voice was clear, not the tentative, uncertain voice of a 3-year-old overcome with anxiety, but clear, certain, and absolutely unwavering. 3 words that would echo through that courtroom and reverberate through the Denver Police Department and ripple outward into the legal consciousness of everyone present. "Bad man," Emma said, her tiny finger still pointing directly at Marcus Webb. The words hung in the air like a bell toll. They seemed to vibrate through the courtroom's atmosphere, carrying weight and gravity far beyond what 3-year-old words should be able to carry. Bad man. 2 simple words from the most innocent voice in the room. 2 words that contained no legal jargon, no complicated testimony, no ambiguous language that could be picked apart by ruthless cross-examination. Just truth, pure, simple, crystalline truth. Marcus Webb's expression changed. For the first time since the trial began, his carefully constructed mask of indifference cracked. His jaw clenched. His eyes narrowed. A flicker of something, rage perhaps, or the recognition of being truly seen, passed across his face. Victor Blackwood had gone completely pale. He seemed to shrink slightly in his chair, as if the weight of that simple declaration had physically diminished him. He had built his entire defense on complexity, on reasonable doubt, on attacking the reliability of adult testimony. But he had no defense against the primitive truth being spoken by a child. Then Emma turned back to Max. Her pointing finger lowered. Her expression transformed into something tender, something filled with love and gratitude, and the kind of complete certainty that only comes from a being whose nervous system has finally found safety. "Good dog," Emma whispered, her voice soft and reverent, filled with the kind of affection that made the words carry almost religious significance. The contrast was stunning. From the loudness of judgment to the softness of praise, from pointing outward to pointing inward, from identifying darkness to celebrating light. Good dog, 2 words that seemed to contain the entire philosophy of redemption and kindness and unconditional love. Max's tail wagged once, just once, a single, deliberate movement that seemed to acknowledge and receive Emma's acknowledgement. The dog didn't jump, didn't try to lick her face, didn't celebrate. Max simply remained perfectly present, understanding on some profound level that he had been seen and recognized and thanked. The courtroom erupted into a kind of stunned silence that was louder than any noise could be. People exchanged glances. Some members of the jury were visibly emotional, their eyes glistening. Judge Morrison had stepped all the way into the courtroom now, her expression revealing the profound impact of what she had just witnessed. Sarah felt tears flowing freely down her cheeks. She made no move to wipe them away. This moment, this beautiful, extraordinary moment, was everything she had worked toward. Not justice through legal procedure, but justice recognized through the clarity of innocent perception. Linda Morrison had her arms around her daughter now, holding her close, her own eyes filled with wonder. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, but she understood that her 3-year-old daughter had just done something extraordinary, had just spoken a truth that echoed through the courtroom like the voice of something larger than herself. Emma sat calmly with her hand still resting on Max's head, her panic completely gone, her anxiety entirely dissipated. She had said what needed to be said. She had recognized what needed to be recognized, and somehow she understood that it mattered. The bailiff looked toward Judge Morrison, uncertain whether to announce the formal resumption of proceedings or whether this moment required something different, something more, something that transcended normal courtroom protocol. Judge Morrison took a deep breath. She looked at the defendant. She looked at the jury. She looked at the child and the dog. And then she spoke, her voice carrying a weight of emotion usually absent from judicial pronouncements. "Let the record reflect," she said slowly, "that we are resuming the trial of the people versus Marcus Webb. The witness Rachel Martinez will be recalled to the stand for redirect examination." But everyone in that courtroom knew that something fundamental had changed. A 3-year-old child and a German shepherd had just delivered a verdict that transcended the legal system itself. The verdict of truth. The courtroom remained in a state of suspended animation for approximately 30 seconds after Emma spoke those words. 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. 30 seconds during which the entire psychological landscape of the trial shifted on its axis. Judge Morrison stood at the front of the courtroom, her hand still on the judge's bench. Her face was a complex mixture of emotions: shock, awe, concern about courtroom procedure, and the dawning realization that something profoundly significant had just occurred outside the normal bounds of legal testimony. She had authorized Max's presence to help Rachel through her testimony. She had never anticipated that the dog's most important contribution would happen during recess, delivered not by a traumatized adult, but by a 3-year-old child. The jury members sat in their seats, exchanging glances that communicated everything without words. They had been instructed to base their verdict solely on admissible evidence. They had been told repeatedly that they must focus only on what was presented during official testimony. They understood their legal duty, but they also understood on a level far deeper than logic that they had just witnessed something true. Very, very true. One of the jurors, an older woman in her late 60s named Margaret Chen, had tears streaming down her face. She wasn't crying because of sentiment or emotion alone. She was crying because a 3-year-old child had just articulated something that the entire legal system had been struggling to prove for 3 weeks: that Marcus Webb was a bad man, that he was dangerous, that he was capable of the violence Rachel Martinez had described. A young man on the jury, probably in his early 30s, was shaking his head slightly as if trying to process what he had just seen. His expression had transformed from skepticism to absolute conviction. He had come into this trial with doubts about Rachel's testimony. He had been influenced by Blackwood's systematic demolition of her credibility. But Emma's simple declaration, "bad man," had somehow reached past all his rational defenses and touched something more fundamental. The foreman of the jury, a middle-aged businessman who prided himself on logical thinking and careful analysis, found himself completely overwhelmed. He had been trained in critical thinking. He had extensive experience evaluating evidence, but he had no training for this. No preparation for the moment when a child's innocent perception would cut through all the complexity and reveal something undeniably true. Rachel Martinez, sitting in a private consultation room with victim advocates, didn't even know what had just happened in the courtroom, but she would find out soon enough. And when she did, something inside her would shift. The devastation from Blackwood's cross-examination, the crushing sense that her testimony had failed, that she would be disbelieved, all of it would transform the moment she learned that a 3-year-old had pointed at the defendant and said, "bad man." Victor Blackwood sat at the defense table with his head bowed. His usual expression of confident superiority had been completely erased. He was a master of legal strategy, a brilliant attorney who had successfully dismantled countless witnesses through careful manipulation and skillful questioning. But he had no strategy for this. No courtroom tactic that could counter the simple truth spoken by a child whose nervous system was too innocent to be corrupted by legal complexity. Blackwood understood with cold clarity that he had lost. Not legally, perhaps. The trial would continue. There would be closing arguments and jury deliberation. But the moment of real judgment had already passed. Emma had rendered her verdict, and the jury had absorbed it into their consciousness in a way that no amount of legal argument could erase. Marcus Webb's face remained relatively impassive, but his hands gripped the edge of the defense table so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His cold eyes continued to stare at nothing in particular, but everyone in the courtroom could feel the rage simmering beneath his controlled exterior. He had spent his entire life manipulating people, exploiting their weaknesses, convincing them to see what he wanted them to see. And now, a 3-year-old child had seen through all of that and identified him for exactly what he was. Sarah Chen remained seated in the front row, tears flowing openly down her cheeks. She made no attempt to hide her emotion. Her eyes were fixed on Emma and Max, and her expression was one of profound gratitude and vindication. She had dedicated 6 years to training Max in victim support. She had believed in the power of the human-animal bond. She had advocated for unconventional approaches to trauma support. And now, in a single moment, all of that belief had been validated in the most extraordinary way possible. Max remained perfectly still beside Emma, his body language unchanged, his composure absolute. But Sarah could feel something shift in the dog as well. Max seemed to understand, on some level, that he had accomplished something significant, that his presence had mattered in a way that transcended normal police work. Linda Morrison held her daughter close, her own mind reeling with what had just transpired. She had come to this trial out of necessity, burdened by the responsibility of bringing her youngest child to a place she didn't understand. She had felt frustrated, exhausted, inadequate. But now, she was beginning to understand that her daughter had just done something extraordinary. Emma had seen something that adults trained in the law had struggled to see. Emma had spoken a truth that transcended the complexity of legal testimony. Judge Morrison finally moved. She approached the bench, and her voice, when she spoke, carried a different quality than before. There was emotion in her tone now, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. "Let the record reflect," she said slowly, "that the recess is concluded. The prosecution will now proceed with redirect examination of the witness Rachel Martinez." A bailiff was dispatched to retrieve Rachel from the consultation room, but everyone in the courtroom understood that this would be a different Rachel. The same woman would return to the witness stand, but she would return transformed by the knowledge that a 3-year-old child had validated her testimony, had called the defendant exactly what he was, had provided the moral clarity that Blackwood had tried to strip away. When Rachel returned to the courtroom 5 minutes later, she was visibly different. Her posture had straightened. Her expression had changed from despair to something resembling hope. She didn't know exactly what had happened during the recess. Victim advocates had simply told her that something significant had occurred and that she should trust the process. Rachel took the stand again, and this time, something fundamental had shifted within her. She made direct eye contact with the jury. She spoke with absolute certainty. When Prosecutor James Richardson asked her to describe the defendant's face, and the moment she identified him, Rachel's voice was steady and unwavering. "I will never forget his face," she said, her eyes moving across each jury member's face individually. "I will never forget the evil in his eyes that night. He is a bad man, and I know exactly what I saw." The words landed differently now. Every jury member heard them with new understanding, filtered through the lens of Emma's simple declaration. Rachel wasn't just a traumatized woman making claims. She was a person who had been validated by an innocent child's perception. She was a person who had been seen and believed, not by the legal system, but by the purest form of human truth-telling available. Even Victor Blackwood's redirect examination couldn't regain the ground he had lost. He tried his usual tactics, questioning Rachel's memory, suggesting alternative explanations, planting seeds of doubt. But it was futile. The jury had already made up their minds. Emma had already delivered the verdict. Everything that followed was merely procedural formality. Sarah watched as the dynamic in the courtroom shifted completely. The jury's body language had changed. Their facial expressions had changed. The energy in the room had transformed from uncertainty to conviction. A 3-year-old girl and a German shepherd had done what 3 weeks of legal testimony could not accomplish. They had made the jury understand, not just intellectually but emotionally, that Marcus Webb was exactly what Emma had called him: a bad man. And that truth, spoken with the clarity of innocence, would prove impossible to overcome. The jury deliberated for exactly 17 hours spread across 2 days. In normal circumstances, such deliberation would suggest uncertainty, disagreement, complexity. But everyone involved in the trial understood that the jury wasn't deliberating about guilt or innocence. They had already decided that. They were deliberating about the specific charges, about the degree of guilt, about ensuring that their verdict was airtight and completely defensible. Sarah Chen spent those 17 hours in a state of peculiar suspension. She returned home with Max, fed the dog, went through the normal routines of her day. But her mind never truly left that courtroom. She kept replaying the moment, Emma's pointing finger, the 2 words spoken with such clarity and certainty, the transformation that had occurred in the room's emotional atmosphere. Max seemed equally suspended. The dog remained calm, but Sarah could sense that he knew something significant was unfolding. Animals often possess that capacity to understand when important moments hung in the balance. Max would lie in his favorite spot on the living room rug, his eyes tracking Sarah's movements, his presence a comforting anchor for both of them. Linda Morrison spent those 17 hours telling the story of what had happened in the courtroom to anyone who would listen. She called her mother, her sister, her closest friends. She described Emma's panic, Max's approach, the moment when her 3-year-old daughter had pointed at the defendant and called him a bad man. People struggled to understand the magnitude of what Linda was describing, but they heard the wonder in her voice and understood that something extraordinary had occurred. Emma, for her part, had moved on with the resilience of a young child. She didn't fully understand what had happened in that courtroom. She just knew that a big, wonderful dog had made her feel safe. She just knew that something she had said seemed to matter to the grown-ups. She returned to her normal life, preschool, playdates, bedtime stories, blissfully unaware that she had just altered the trajectory of a criminal trial. Rachel Martinez spent those 17 hours in a state of healing that would have been impossible before Emma's declaration. The victim advocate who had stayed with her during the recess had explained, as carefully as possible, that a small child had pointed at the defendant and called him a bad man. Rachel had wept when she heard this, not tears of sadness, but tears of vindication. Finally, someone had seen what she had seen. Finally, someone had recognized the evil she had encountered that terrible night. Marcus Webb spent those 17 hours in a holding cell, his controlled exterior finally cracking under the weight of understanding that his manipulation had failed. He had spent his entire life as a predator, reading people, exploiting weaknesses, using charm and intimidation to get what he wanted. And a 3-year-old child had seen through all of it, had recognized him for exactly what he was. The psychological impact of that recognition gnawed at him in ways that years of interrogation could not. Victor Blackwood spent those 17 hours reviewing every word of testimony, every legal argument, searching desperately for grounds for appeal. He was a brilliant attorney, but he was also a realist. He understood that the jury had reached their verdict before they even retired to the jury room. Emma's declaration had predetermined the outcome. Everything that followed, closing arguments, jury instructions, deliberation, was merely theater. Finally, at 2:15 p.m. on Friday afternoon, the jury returned to the courtroom. Judge Morrison sat at her bench, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes betraying awareness of what was coming. The attorneys took their positions. The defendant was led back into the courtroom. The gallery filled with spectators who had been waiting for this moment. Sarah sat in the front row with Max. She had taken the afternoon off work specifically to be present for the verdict. Max sat with perfect composure, his black and tan coat gleaming under the courtroom lights. The jury filed in solemnly, their expressions serious and determined. The foreman, the middle-aged businessman who had been so overwhelmed by Emma's words, looked directly at the defendant as he took his seat. There was something final in that look, something that said, "I have seen the truth about you." Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Morrison asked formally. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied. "On the count of burglary in the first degree, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty," the foreman said firmly. "On the count of assault in the second degree?" "Guilty." "On the count of armed robbery?" "Guilty." The litany continued. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Every single count, every single charge. The defendant was convicted on all 18 counts related to a series of home invasions that had terrorized the Denver suburban community. Marcus Webb's expression didn't change. He had expected this, but the weight of complete conviction seemed to physically press down on him. There would be no acquittals, no hung jury, no mistrial. There was only the absolute judgment of 12 citizens who had decided, with absolute certainty, that he was exactly what Emma had called him. A bad man. Rachel Martinez, sitting in the gallery, began to weep. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief so profound that her entire body shook with them. Justice had been served. The truth had prevailed. Her testimony, which had seemed so thoroughly destroyed by Blackwood's cross-examination, had ultimately been vindicated. The courtroom was adjourned, and the bailiffs led Marcus Webb away in handcuffs. As he was escorted from the courtroom, his eyes briefly passed over the spot where Emma had been sitting. But Emma wasn't there anymore. Linda had decided not to bring her daughter to the verdict hearing. Emma had done her part. Emma had spoken her truth. Now it was time for Emma to just be a normal 3-year-old. In the parking lot outside the courthouse, Sarah was preparing to load Max into the police vehicle when she heard her name being called. She turned to see the Morrison family approaching. Tom, Linda, and between them, Emma in her pink dress with the white flowers. Emma broke free from her father's hand and ran directly toward Max with the unself-conscious joy that only a young child could muster. She threw her small arms around Max's neck, burying her face in his fur. "Hi, Max," she said simply. "Thank you for being nice to me." Max's tail wagged slowly, his eyes closing slightly as if he was experiencing a moment of pure contentment. The dog seemed to understand that he was being thanked for something beyond normal interaction. He was being thanked for bearing witness to truth. "Thank you," Linda said to Sarah, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing Max today. I don't know what would have happened if Emma had completely fallen apart in there. That dog did something truly special." Sarah knelt to Emma's level, and the little girl stroked Max's ears with gentle reverence. "Max is a very special dog," Sarah said, "and you are a very special girl." That evening, Sarah filed a special commendation report with the Denver Police Department. She documented Max's therapeutic intervention with Emma, the unexpected outcome, the impact on the trial. The report would circulate through the department, becoming part of Max's official record. But more than that, it would become a story, a legend. The story of a police dog who had helped ensure justice not through traditional police work, but through compassion and presence. Years later, when Emma Morrison was 8 years old, her parents finally told her the complete story of what had happened in that courtroom. They explained that she had been genuinely brave, that she had trusted her instincts in a way many adults couldn't, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest truth. Emma kept newspaper clippings from the trial in a special box under her bed. She would pull them out occasionally and read them, marveling at the idea that she had been part of something significant, that her simple words, "bad man," "good dog," had helped put a dangerous criminal in prison. When Emma was 16 years old, she volunteered at an animal shelter, inspired by memories of Max. When she was 18, she started college, majoring in criminal justice with a focus on victim advocacy. Her life had been shaped by that moment in the courtroom, by the child she had been and the dog who had grounded her in safety during chaos. Max continued his service with the Denver Police Department for 5 more glorious years. He responded to countless calls, protected numerous officers, and apprehended many dangerous criminals. but the courtroom incident remained the most talked-about moment of his career. His name became legendary within the department, not just for his police work, but for the day he had helped a frightened child speak truth that transcended legal complexity. When Max finally retired at age 9, Detective Sarah Chen took him home to her modest house with its large, fenced backyard. Max spent his final years playing with neighborhood children, visiting schools, and spreading joy wherever he went. He had earned his rest, not through years of police work alone, but through a single perfect moment of compassion that had changed the trajectory of a trial and a child's entire life. On warm afternoons, Emma would sometimes visit Sarah and Max, and the two of them, now young woman and aging dog, would sit together in that backyard. Emma would stroke Max's graying fur and tell him stories about her life, her studies, her dream of becoming a victim advocate. And Max, in his final years, would listen with the same calm presence that had transformed a courtroom and changed lives. Justice, it turned out, had a four-legged face and a wagging tail.